Money is a shared hallucination. We all agree that a piece of green paper represents a house, a car, or a meal. But before there was the green paper, before there was the dollar, there was chaos. Welcome to the Boring Archive. Tonight, we peel back the layers of this hallucination. We go back to when value was heavy, to when you couldn't fold your wealth and put it in your pocket. Let's drift back to the colonies. The year is 1700. There is no United States. There is no Federal Reserve. If you wanted to buy a bag of flour or a horse, you didn't swipe a card. You used whatever you had. You used musket balls. You used beaver pelts. You used tobacco. In Virginia, tobacco was legal tender. You could pay your taxes with dried leaves. Imagine the smell of that treasury. But the most common coin in the pockets of the Founding Fathers was not British. It was Spanish. The Spanish milled dollar, also known as the piece of 8, Real de Ocho. It was a heavy silver coin minted in Mexico City or Potosí, Bolivia. It weighed approximately 27.07 grams and was 93% silver. Why do we call it a dollar? The word comes from a valley in Bohemia called Joachimsthal. In this valley, silver was mined and turned into coins called Joachimsthaler. That name was shortened to thaler. Thaler became daler. Daler became dollar. The sound of the word changed as it crossed the Atlantic, but the need for it remained constant. The colonists tried to print their own paper money. It was called colonial scrip. Massachusetts issued the first one in 1690. It was primitive. It was easy to fake. And because too much of it was printed, its value collapsed. Benjamin Franklin, a printer by trade, tried to stop the counterfeiters. He came up with a trick. He printed nature patterns on the back of the bills, leaves, actual leaf prints. Because the complex veins of a leaf are nearly impossible to copy by hand. But it wasn't enough. The economy became a mess of Spanish silver, Portuguese gold, and worthless paper, until the revolution ended, and a new nation decided it needed its own. The Massachusetts Bay Colony Experiment. In 1690, Massachusetts did something that had never been done before in the American colonies. They issued paper money. Not because they were innovators. Not because they had some grand vision. They issued paper money because they were broke. The colony had just finished a military expedition against Quebec. It failed. The soldiers came back expecting payment. The colonial treasury was empty. So the General Court of Massachusetts decided to print promissory notes that could be used to pay taxes. These notes were called bills of credit. They were essentially IOUs from the government. You could use them to pay your taxes, which meant they had value. If you needed to pay £20 in taxes and you had a £20 note, you were set. The government would accept it. This was revolutionary, but not in the way most people think. It wasn't revolutionary because paper money was new. Paper money had existed in China since the Song dynasty. It wasn't revolutionary because it replaced coins. It was revolutionary because it created a new relationship between government debt and currency. Let me explain this slowly because it's important and also deeply boring. When Massachusetts issued these bills of credit, they were creating money out of thin air. But they were also creating an obligation. The bills were promises that the government would accept them for tax payment. This meant the value of the bills was tied to two things: the tax burden of the colony and the trustworthiness of the government. If the government issued too many bills relative to the tax base, the bills would lose value. If people didn't trust the government to accept the bills, they would lose value. This is the fundamental problem of fiat currency, and Massachusetts discovered it in 1690. Over the next few decades, Massachusetts issued more bills. In 1702, They issued more to fund another military expedition. In 1709, more bills. In 1711, more bills. Each time they promised to retire the old bills through taxation. Sometimes they did. Often they didn't. By 1714, the bills had depreciated significantly. A bill that said £20 on it might only buy £15 worth of goods. Merchants started refusing them or demanding more bills for the same goods. The government responded by printing more bills to cover the difference. This is where it gets tedious, but stay with me. In 1716, the Massachusetts General Court passed an act to stabilize the currency. They set a redemption schedule for the outstanding bills. They promised to collect taxes in silver and use that silver to retire the paper bills. They set quotas for each town. The town of Boston had to collect 1,247 pounds, 6 shillings and 8 pence. The town of Salem had to collect 416 pounds, 9 shillings and 2 pence. Concord had to collect 83 pounds, 6 shillings and 4 pence. These numbers were calculated based on the assessed wealth of each town, which was determined by a committee that visited each property and estimated its value. Are you still awake? Good. Let's continue. The Land Bank Controversy. In 1740, Massachusetts faced a currency crisis. There weren't enough bills in circulation for normal commerce. Merchants wanted more money in the economy. But the government was trying to maintain the value of existing bills by limiting new issuance. A group of merchants proposed a solution, a private land bank. The idea was simple. Landowners could mortgage their property to the bank and receive bills backed by the land. The bills could be used for trade. The landowner would pay back the loan with interest over time. This was essentially private money creation. The land bank would issue bills, those bills would circulate as currency, and they would be backed by real estate rather than government promises. The Massachusetts General Court approved the land bank in 1740. Within months, over 1,000 people had signed up as partners. The bank issued bills worth over £49,000. Commerce expanded. Debtors loved it because it increased the money supply and made debts easier to pay. Creditors hated it for the same reason. The creditors, led by the merchant elite of Boston, petitioned the British Parliament to shut down the land bank. They argued that it was creating inflation and destroying the value of existing debts. In 1741, Parliament extended the Bubble Act to the colonies, which prohibited joint stock companies without royal charter. The land bank was forced to close. This created a massive problem. The land bank had issued bills that were circulating throughout the colony. People held these bills expecting to use them. Merchants had accepted them as payment. Now the bills were worthless. The partners of the land bank were held personally liable for the bills. They had to redeem them at face value using their personal property. Some partners were ruined. One of these partners was John Adams' father. Years later, John Adams would cite this experience as part of his motivation for supporting American independence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We still have 35 years of colonial currency to cover. The Currency Acts and colonial trade. The land bank controversy convinced Parliament that the colonies needed stricter currency regulation. In 1751, they passed the Currency Act, which applied to New England colonies. The act prohibited the colonies from issuing bills of credit as legal tender. They could still issue bills, but those bills couldn't be required for private debts. Merchants could refuse them. This created a strange situation. The government could print money, but they couldn't force people to accept it. The value of the money depended entirely on voluntary acceptance. Massachusetts complied with the act. They issued bills but didn't make them legal tender. The bills circulated based on trust and convenience. Gradually, the outstanding bills were retired through taxation. By 1760, Massachusetts had almost no paper currency in circulation. Commerce relied primarily on coins: Spanish dollars, Portuguese johannesses, English guineas, and various other foreign coins. Each coin had a different value which had to be calculated for every transaction. A Spanish dollar was worth 6 shillings. A Portuguese johannes was worth 4 pounds. An English guinea was worth 21 shillings. A French pistole was worth 22 shillings. These rates fluctuated based on the silver and gold content of each coin. Merchants kept conversion tables. A ledger from a Boston merchant in 1762 shows transactions in 7 different currencies in a single week. On Monday, he accepted payment in Spanish dollars. On Tuesday, English shillings. On Wednesday, bills of credit from Rhode Island, which hadn't complied with the Currency Act as strictly as Massachusetts. On Thursday, Portuguese gold coins. On Friday, a promissory note from another merchant. This system was cumbersome, but it worked. Mostly. There were constant disputes about exchange rates and coin quality. Merchants would weigh coins to verify their metal content. Clipped coins, coins where someone had shaved off the edges to steal the metal, were common. Counterfeit coins circulated regularly. Are you asleep yet? No. Let's talk about the Currency Act of 1764. The Currency Act of 1751 only applied to New England. The other colonies continued to issue paper money as legal tender. This annoyed British merchants, who often ended up with colonial bills they couldn't use. In 1764, Parliament extended the Currency Act to all colonies. No colony could issue bills of credit as legal tender for private debts. They could issue bills for public purposes, paying government expenses, but those bills couldn't be forced on private creditors. The colonies protested. They argued that the shortage of British coins made paper money necessary for commerce. Without paper currency, trade would collapse. Debts couldn't be paid. The economy would freeze. Parliament didn't care. The law stood. The colonial assemblies found loopholes. They issued bills for public purposes and created systems where merchants would voluntarily accept the bills. Some colonies established loan offices that would lend money at low interest rates. The borrower would receive bills, spend them in the economy, and slowly pay back the loan. This created a pseudo-banking system. The loan offices acted like banks, creating money through lending. But they were technically government operations, not private banks, which made them legal under British law. Virginia's Loan Office, established in 1755, issued £240,000 in bills. Borrowers mortgaged their land and received currency. They paid 5% annual interest. The loan term was 25 years. The interest revenue went to the colonial government. By 1764, Virginia had nearly £300,000 in loan office bills circulating. These bills were used for almost all large transactions in the colony. When the Currency Act of 1764 banned legal tender paper money, Virginia faced a crisis. The Virginia House of Burgesses sent a petition to Parliament. They explained the necessity of paper currency. They provided statistics on trade volumes. They described the shortage of coins. They requested an exemption from the Currency Act. Parliament denied the petition. Virginia continued issuing bills anyway, using increasingly creative legal justifications. Other colonies did the same. By 1770, there were approximately £2 million worth of colonial paper currency circulating, despite the Currency Act. The enforcement of the Currency Act varied. Some royal governors strictly prohibited legal tender bills. Others looked the other way. The British government focused on other colonial issues like taxation and trade regulation, didn't prioritize currency enforcement. This continued until 1775, when the political situation made colonial currency The First Continental Congress and Currency. When the Continental Congress convened in 1775, they faced an immediate problem: how to fund a war with no money. The colonies had no unified treasury. Each colony had its own currency system. There was no power to tax. The Congress was an assembly of representatives with no legal authority to compel anyone to do anything. On June 22, 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the issuance of $2 million in bills of credit. These were called Continentals. They were printed with the promise that the United Colonies would redeem them for Spanish milled dollars at a future date. Note the careful language. Not would redeem them in Spanish dollars immediately, but at a future date. The Congress had no Spanish dollars. They had no way to get Spanish dollars. They were promising to eventually, somehow, acquire Spanish dollars and redeem the bills. This was money creation through collective belief. The Continentals had value because people believed they would eventually be redeemable. And because the Continental Army needed to be paid, and this was the only way to do it. The initial $2 million weren't enough. On July 25, 1775, Congress authorized another $1 million. On November 29, 1775, another $3 million. By the end of 1775, $6 million in Continentals were circulating. Each bill was hand-signed by two designated signers. The bills had elaborate border designs to prevent counterfeiting. They featured patriotic slogans in Latin. Exodus in dubio estate. The outcome is in doubt. Tribulatio ditat. Trials enrich. Serenabit. It will clear up. The bills came in denominations from $0.00 to $80. The small denominations were for everyday purchases. The large denominations were for military contracts and large debts. Congress promised that the bills would be redeemed by taxes levied on the states. Each state was assigned a quota based on population. They would collect taxes and send the revenue to Congress, which would use it to retire the Continentals. This system had a fundamental problem. Congress couldn't enforce the tax quotas. If a state didn't want to pay, Congress had no mechanism to make them. The states had varying degrees of enthusiasm for funding the Continental Army. Some states paid their full quota. Others paid a fraction. Some paid nothing. By 1776, it was clear that tax revenue wouldn't be sufficient to redeem the Continentals. Congress continued printing anyway. In 1776, they issued $19 million. In 1777, $13 million. In 1778, $63 million. The more they printed, the less each bill was worth. The depreciation of continental currency. In early 1776, a continental dollar was worth approximately one Spanish silver dollar. By late 1776, it was worth about 80 cents. By late 1777, about 50 cents. By late 1778, about 20 cents. The depreciation created chaos in the economy. Merchants didn't know what price to charge. If they accepted continentals at face value, they would lose money as the currency depreciated. If they refused continentals, they would lose business and might be accused of disloyalty to the revolutionary cause. Some merchants demanded payment in specie, gold or silver coins. This angered the Continental Congress, which saw it as undermining the war effort. Several states passed laws requiring merchants to accept continentals at face value. Pennsylvania passed such a law in 1777. Merchants who refused continentals could be fined or imprisoned. This didn't stop the depreciation. It just created a black market. Merchants would publicly accept continentals at face value, but they would raise their prices to compensate for the currency's declining value. A coat that cost $2 in silver would cost $10 in continentals. The Continental Congress tried to fix this with price controls. In 1777, they recommended that states set maximum prices for essential goods. The goal was to prevent inflation and profiteering. The price controls failed. Merchants stopped selling goods rather than sell them at a loss. Shortages developed. The black market expanded. By 1778, most states had abandoned price controls. Congress tried another approach: state requisitions. Instead of printing money to buy supplies, they would requisition supplies directly from the states. Each state had a quota of wheat, beef, cloth, and other goods to provide to the army. This also failed. Some states provided their quota. Others provided a fraction. The Continental Army continued to lack basic supplies. By 1779, the Continental dollar was worth about 5 cents. Congress had issued over $225 million in currency. The tax revenue collected by the states totaled about $3 million. The gap between currency issued and currency retired was widening. In September 1779, Congress stopped printing Continentals. They had printed $241,552,780. The outstanding currency was depreciating so rapidly that printing more would be pointless. Instead, they tried a different strategy: requisitions in kind and foreign loans. France was providing loans and subsidies. Spain was providing some support. The Netherlands might be convinced to help. These foreign funds, combined with direct requisitions of goods from the states, would fund the war. Meanwhile, the existing Continentals continued to circulate and continued to depreciate. The devaluation of 1780. By 1780, Continentals were nearly worthless. It took 40 Continental dollars to buy one Spanish silver dollar. The phrase "not worth a Continental" entered American slang. Congress decided to attempt a currency reform. In March 1780, they passed a resolution devaluing the Continentals at a ratio of 40-1. Holders of Continentals could exchange them for new bills at this ratio. 40 old dollars would become one new dollar. The new bills would be issued by the states, not Congress. Each state would issue its share of new bills and exchange them for old Continentals. The new bills would be backed by state taxation and eventually redeemed in specie. The states were unenthusiastic. They had their own currency problems. Many states had issued their own bills during the war, and those bills were also depreciating. Adding continental currency reform to their problems was unwelcome. Some states complied partially with the 1780 resolution. Others ignored it. The result was a patchwork of old continentals, new state bills, and various other forms of currency, all circulating at different values. By 1781, most trade was conducted in specie or in kind. Farmers sold wheat for silver coins or traded it directly for manufactured goods. Merchants demanded payment in coin. The continental currency had essentially ceased to function as money. Congress never formally repudiated the continentals, but they never redeemed them either. Holders of continental currency lost their investment. This would have profound effects on the debate over the Constitution later in the decade. State currencies during the Confederation. After the war, each state had its own currency system. Some states issued paper money to help debtors. Others relied primarily on coins. The result was monetary chaos. In 1785, Rhode Island issued 100,000 pounds in paper money. The bills were loaned to borrowers at 4% interest. The borrowers would repay over 14 years. The bills were legal tender for all debts. Creditors hated this. Their debtors could repay loans in depreciated paper money. A debt of 100 pounds in silver could be repaid with 100 pounds in Rhode Island paper, which was worth maybe 50 pounds in silver. Some creditors fled the state to avoid being paid in paper money. The Rhode Island legislature passed a law requiring creditors to accept the paper money. If a creditor refused, the debtor could deposit the money with a court, and the debt would be considered paid. This led to absurd situations. Debtors would track down their creditors and attempt to pay them with paper money. Creditors would run away. Debtors would chase them. If the debtor could prove they had attempted to pay, the court would discharge the debt. One case involved a butcher who owed money to a merchant. The butcher showed up at the merchant's shop with paper money. The merchant saw him coming and locked the door. The butcher left the money on the doorstep and informed the court. The court ruled the debt was paid. Other states had different systems. Massachusetts relied primarily on specie and had very little paper money. This created hardship for debtors who couldn't get currency to pay their debts. In 1786, this contributed to Shays' Rebellion, where farmers protested debt collection and tax policies. New York issued moderate amounts of paper money and managed it relatively well. Pennsylvania had a mixed system. Virginia had mostly retired its paper currency by 1785. North Carolina continued issuing paper money throughout the 1780s. The lack of a unified currency made interstate commerce difficult. A merchant in Boston selling goods to a buyer in Philadelphia had to negotiate the currency of payment. Spanish dollars were widely accepted. State paper money was problematic. Exchange rates fluctuated. This chaos was one of the motivations for the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Hamilton's financial plan. When Alexander Hamilton became Treasury Secretary in 1789, the United States was financially broken. The federal government owed about $54 million in domestic debt and $12 million in foreign debt. The states collectively owed about $25 million. There was no federal revenue system. There was no national currency. Hamilton proposed a comprehensive financial plan. First, the federal government would assume state debts. This was controversial. States that had already paid off much of their debt, like Virginia, didn't want to pay for states that hadn't, like Massachusetts. Second, the federal government would issue new bonds to refinance the debt. Holders of old continental and state bonds could exchange them for new federal bonds. The new bonds would pay regular interest and would be backed by federal tax revenue. Third, the government would establish new revenue sources. Tariffs on imports and excise taxes on certain goods like whiskey. Fourth, and most controversially, Hamilton proposed a national bank. The Bank of the United States. Hamilton's proposal for a national bank was modeled on the Bank of England. The bank would be chartered by the federal government but owned by private shareholders. It would have a capital of $10 million. The government would own 20% of the shares. Private investors would own 80%. The bank would serve several functions. It would hold government deposits. It would issue banknotes that could circulate as currency. It would make loans to the government and to private borrowers. It would manage the government's bond operations. The bank's notes would be redeemable for gold or silver on demand. This convertibility would maintain the note's value. The bank would maintain reserves of specie to ensure it could always meet redemption requests. Congress debated the bank proposal for months. James Madison opposed it, arguing that the Constitution didn't give Congress the power to charter a bank. Hamilton argued that the bank was necessary and proper for executing Congress's enumerated powers. President Washington asked his cabinet for opinions. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson opposed the bank. Attorney General Edmund Randolph opposed it. Treasury Secretary Hamilton supported it. Washington sided with Hamilton and signed the bank bill in February 1791. The Bank of the United States opened in Philadelphia in December 1791. The government purchased $2 million in shares. Private investors subscribed to $8 million in shares. The subscription was oversubscribed. Investors wanted to buy more shares than were available. This was a good sign. It meant investors had confidence in the bank. The bank stock immediately began trading above par value. Bank operations and currency. The Bank of the United States began issuing notes in early 1792. The notes were denominations of $5, $10, $20, $50, and $100. They were printed on high-quality paper with intricate engravings to prevent counterfeiting. Each note was a promise to pay the bearer in gold or silver coin on demand. If you held a $10 note and walked into the bank, they would give you $10 in coin. This convertibility was crucial to maintaining trust in the notes. The bank had to carefully manage its note issuance. If it issued too many notes, it wouldn't have enough specie reserves to redeem them all. If it issued too few notes, it would fail to provide enough currency for the growing economy. The bank established a reserve ratio. For every dollar in notes issued, it would hold a certain amount in specie reserves. The exact ratio was a matter of judgment. Too high, and the bank would be too conservative, limiting its profitability. Too low, and the bank risked being unable to meet redemptions. In practice, the bank maintained reserves of about 25 to 33% of its note circulation. If it had $1 million in notes outstanding, it would hold $250,000 to $330,000 in specie. This might seem risky. What if everyone showed up to redeem their notes at once? The bank would fail. But in normal times, most people didn't redeem notes. They used them as currency. Notes were more convenient than carrying bags of coins. As long as people trusted that they could redeem notes if they wanted to, they were content to hold and use the notes. The Bank of the United States also performed another crucial function. It disciplined state banks. State banks and the regulation function. Alongside the Bank of the United States, numerous state-chartered banks emerged in the 1790s and 1800s. These banks also issued notes. A bank in Boston would issue notes. A bank in New York would issue notes. A bank in Charleston would issue notes. Each bank's notes were different. They looked different, they had different denominations, and they had different levels of trustworthiness. A note from a well-managed bank with good reserves was reliable. A note from a shaky bank might not be. This created a problem. How do you know if a bank note is good? If a merchant in Philadelphia receives a note from a bank in Kentucky, how does he know it's worth face value? The Bank of the United States helped solve this problem. When it received state bank notes, either as deposits or in business transactions, it would periodically present them to the issuing bank for redemption in specie. This acted as a check on state banks. If a state bank issued too many notes, the Bank of the United States would accumulate them and demand redemption. The state bank would have to pay out specie, reducing its reserves. If the state bank couldn't pay, it would be exposed as unsound. This disciplinary function made the Bank of the United States unpopular with state banks. They saw it as a competitor and a regulator. But it helped maintain the quality of the currency system. By 1800, the Bank of the United States had about $5 million in notes in circulation. State banks collectively had about 15 to 20 million in notes in circulation. Additionally, foreign coins, primarily Spanish dollars, continued to circulate. The total money supply was approximately $30 to $40 million for a population of about 5 million people. The bank's charter expiration. The Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, expiring in 1811. As the expiration approached, debate resumed about whether to recharter the bank. Supporters argued that the bank had been successful. It had helped stabilize government finances. It had provided a reliable national currency. It had facilitated commerce. It had paid dividends to shareholders, including the government. Opponents argued that the bank was unconstitutional. It gave too much power to the federal government. It benefited wealthy investors at the expense of ordinary people. It was a monopoly that stifled competition. State banks lobbied against Rec Harder. They wanted to be free from the Bank of the United States regulatory pressure. The Rec Harder bill passed the House but failed in the Senate by one vote. Vice President George Clinton cast the tie-breaking vote against Rec Harder. In March 1811, the Bank of the United States closed. Its notes were redeemed. Its assets were sold. Its shareholders received their capital back with a small profit. The absence of a national bank would soon prove currency chaos without a national bank. After the Bank of the United States closed in 1811, state banks proliferated. By 1815, there were over 200 state banks, and the number was growing rapidly. Many of these banks were poorly managed. They issued notes far in excess of their specie reserves. They made risky loans. They operated in remote locations where it was difficult for note holders to demand redemption. The result was currency confusion. Merchants couldn't be sure what a banknote was worth. A note from a solid bank in Boston might trade at face value. A note from a questionable bank in rural Pennsylvania might trade at a 20% discount. A note from a failed bank was worthless. Currency brokers emerged to help navigate this confusion. They would assess the quality of different banknotes and quote exchange rates. A published broadsheet from 1814 listed rates for over 100 different banks. Most traded at discounts ranging from 5 to 25%. War financing. When the War of 1812 began, the federal government faced the same problem as during the Revolution: how to pay for the war. Congress tried to fund the war through loans. They issued bonds and hoped investors would buy them. Initially, this worked poorly. The bonds sold at deep discounts. A $100 bond might sell for $80. The government also relied on treasury notes. These were short-term debt instruments that paid interest. They weren't quite currency. They were too high denomination for everyday use, but they circulated among merchants and banks. As the war continued, financing became more difficult. By 1814, the government was struggling to place new bond issues. The treasury was nearly empty. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Dallas proposed creating a new national bank to help manage government finances. The Second Bank of the United States. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. Like the first bank, it had a 20-year charter, mixed public-private ownership, and the power to issue notes and make loans. The Second Bank had a capital of $35 million, much larger than the first bank's $10 million. The government owned 20% of the shares, $7 million. Private investors owned the rest. The bank opened in January 1817 in Philadelphia. The initial management was poor. The bank's first president, William Jones, allowed rapid expansion of loans and note issuance. The bank opened 18 branches around the country. Each branch issued notes and made loans with limited oversight. By 1818, the bank had overextended. It had issued too many notes and made too many risky loans. The ratio of notes to specie reserves had grown dangerously high. When economic conditions tightened in 1818 and 1819, the bank faced a crisis. The Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 was the first major financial crisis in American history. It started with falling commodity prices. Cotton prices fell from 33 cents per pound in 1818 to 14 cents in 1819. Land prices fell. Businesses failed. The Second Bank of the United States, overextended and poorly managed, contracted sharply. It called in loans and reduced note issuance. This worsened the economic contraction. Businesses that might have survived with continued credit failed. Unemployment rose. The bank replaced William Jones with Langdon Cheves, who implemented strict policies to restore the bank's soundness. The bank reduced its loans by more than half. It built up specie reserves. It enforced conservative lending standards. This restored the bank's financial health but prolonged the economic depression. By 1823 the economy had recovered, and the bank was on solid footing. But the bank had gained a reputation for causing economic hardship. Nicholas Biddle and bank expansion. In 1823, Nicholas Biddle became president of the Second Bank. Biddle was a sophisticated financier who understood both the bank's commercial functions and its role in managing the money supply. Under Biddle, the bank expanded operations cautiously. It increased lending while maintaining adequate reserves. It developed techniques for managing seasonal fluctuations in credit demand. It acted as a lender of last resort during minor financial disturbances. The bank also continued its regulatory function over state banks. When it received state bank notes, it would present them for redemption in specie. This limited state banks' ability to overissue notes. By 1830, the Second Bank had about $21 million in notes in circulation. State banks had about $61 million. The total money supply was estimated at around $110 million for a population of about 13 million. Biddle believed the bank was essential to economic stability. He wrote extensively about the bank's role in preventing excessive speculation and maintaining a sound currency. He cultivated relationships with politicians and businessmen. He believed the bank was politically secure. He was wrong. Andrew Jackson's opposition. Andrew Jackson distrusted banks in general and the Second Bank in particular. He believed banks were engines of corruption that benefited the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people. He preferred an economy based on hard money, gold and silver coins. Jackson's opposition to the bank was both philosophical and political. Philosophically, he believed the bank was unconstitutional and undemocratic. Politically, he saw the bank as a tool of his enemies, particularly Henry Clay and the National Republican Party. In 1832, Clay convinced Biddle to apply for renewal of the bank's charter 4 years early, before the 1836 expiration. Clay believed this would create a campaign issue he could use against Jackson in the 1832 presidential election. If Jackson vetoed the rec charter, Clay could argue that Jackson was destroying a vital institution. If Jackson signed it, Clay could claim credit for saving the bank. Congress passed the rec charter bill in July 1832. Jackson vetoed it. Jackson's veto message was a political masterpiece. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional, that it created a monopoly, that it benefited foreign investors and the wealthy elite, and that it undermined democracy. The message resonated with Jackson's political base. Clay tried to make the bank the central issue of the 1832 election. It didn't work. Jackson won in a landslide. The bank war. After his re-election, Jackson decided to destroy the bank before its charter expired. In 1833, he ordered the removal of federal deposits from the bank. Government funds would be placed in selected state banks instead. This was controversial. Treasury Secretary William Duane refused to carry out the order. Jackson fired him and appointed Roger Taney, who complied. Biddle responded by contracting the bank's operations. He reduced loans and note issuance, hoping to create economic pressure that would force Jackson to back down. This was a miscalculation. The contraction caused economic hardship, but Jackson blamed the bank, not his own policies. By 1836, the bank's federal charter expired. It continued operating as a state-chartered bank in Pennsylvania until it failed in 1841. The destruction of the Second Bank of the United States ended the era of national banking in America. For the next 30 years, the country would have no central bank and no nationally regulated currency. State banking proliferation. After the second bank closed, state banking expanded rapidly. States competed to attract banks by offering liberal charter policies. Some states required banks to maintain certain reserve levels and submit to regulatory oversight. Other states had minimal regulation. The number of banks grew from about 500 in 1834 to over 1,500 by 1860. Each bank issued its own notes. A bank in Georgia issued Georgia bank notes. A bank in Ohio issued Ohio bank notes. A bank in Louisiana issued Louisiana bank notes. These notes looked different, had different designs, and had different levels of trustworthiness. Counterfeiters took advantage of the confusion to create fake notes that resembled real notes from obscure banks. Merchants used banknote reporters, published guides that listed which banknotes were reliable and at what discount they should trade. A banknote reporter from 1840 might list: First National Bank of Boston, par no discount Merchants Bank of New York, par Farmers Bank of Virginia, 2% discount Western Bank of Kentucky, 10% discount Traders Bank of Indiana, 15% discount Miners Bank of Michigan, broken, worthless. A merchant receiving payment had to check the banknote reporter to determine what the note was actually worth. If you received a $100 note from a bank trading at a 10% discount, you were really receiving $90. Free banking laws. Starting with Michigan in 1837 and New York in 1838, many states adopted free banking laws. These laws allowed anyone who met certain requirements to open a bank without a special legislative charter. The typical requirements were: deposit government bonds with the state comptroller, receive banknotes equal to the value of the bonds, maintain specie reserves for redemption. The idea was that the bond backing would make the notes safe. If the bank failed, the bonds could be sold to redeem the notes. This worked better in theory than in practice. Some states allowed banks to deposit bonds at inflated values. Some banks deposited low-quality bonds. Some states didn't enforce the regulations strictly. Michigan's experience was particularly chaotic. The state allowed free banking in 1837. Within months, dozens of banks opened. Many were fraudulent operations designed to issue notes and then disappear. These were called wildcat banks, supposedly because they were located in remote areas where only wildcats lived. A promoter would set up a bank in an inaccessible location, issue notes, and make it as difficult as possible for note holders to redeem them. By 1839, Michigan had abandoned free banking. Most of the banks had failed and their notes were worthless. New York's free banking system was more successful. The state required banks to deposit high-quality bonds and maintain stricter oversight. By 1860, New York had over 300 free banks operating successfully. Other states copied New York's model. By 1860, 18 states had free banking laws. The quality varied enormously by state. The Panic of 1837. The proliferation of state banks and easy credit contributed to the Panic of 1837. Land speculation had driven prices to unsustainable levels. Banks had made loans based on inflated land values. When land prices began to fall, banks found themselves holding worthless collateral. President Andrew Jackson's policies had also contributed to instability. His specie circular of 1836 required payment for public lands in gold or silver, not banknotes. This created a sudden demand for specie that banks couldn't meet. In May 1837, New York banks suspended specie payments. They refused to redeem their notes for gold or silver. Within weeks, banks across the country followed suit. The suspension of specie payments meant that banknotes were no longer convertible to metal. A note that promised to pay $10 in gold now paid nothing. The notes still circulated, but at heavy discounts. The panic triggered a severe economic contraction that lasted until 1843. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment rose. The money supply contracted sharply as failed banks' notes became worthless. The panic demonstrated the dangers of an unregulated banking system, but it didn't lead to any national reforms. The country continued with decentralized state banking. Currency confusion at its peak. By 1860, the currency situation in the United States was absurdly complicated. There were approximately 1,600 different banks, each issuing their own notes. This meant there were tens of thousands of different banknote designs in circulation. Additionally, counterfeiters produced fake versions of legitimate notes. A merchant might encounter genuine notes from the First National Bank of Boston, notes from a failed bank with the same name in Pennsylvania, and counterfeit notes claiming to be from the Boston Bank. Banknote reporters became essential business tools. Thompson's Banknote Reporter, published twice monthly, listed thousands of banks and their note values. The publication was dozens of pages long and required constant updates as banks failed or new banks opened. The typical entry might read, Farmers and Merchants Bank, Pottsville, Pennsylvania, notes at 25% discount. Notes altered from Farmers Bank of Virginia circulating. Counterfeit fives in circulation, engraving inferior. Merchants had to be experts in currency authentication. They would examine the paper quality, the engraving detail, the signatures. They would check the banknote reporter. They would calculate the appropriate discount. All of this for every transaction. The inefficiency was staggering. Economists estimate that the costs of this system, the time spent evaluating notes, the losses from counterfeits, the discounts on out-of-state notes, amounted to several percent of GDP. Regional currency systems. Despite the chaos, regional currency systems developed. In New England, notes from Boston banks were widely accepted at par. In New York, notes from New York City banks circulated freely. In the South, notes from Charleston and New Orleans banks had wide acceptance. This created a de facto hierarchy of currencies. A Boston merchant would prefer a note from a Boston bank. He would accept a New York bank note at par or a small discount. He would accept a Western bank note only at a heavy discount or not at all. For long-distance trade, merchants used bills of exchange instead of banknotes. A bill of exchange was essentially a check drawn on a bank in another city. If a merchant in Philadelphia wanted to pay a merchant in New Orleans, he would purchase a bill of exchange from a Philadelphia bank that had an account with a New Orleans bank. This system worked, but it was cumbersome and expensive. Banks charged fees for issuing bills of exchange. There were exchange rate risks. Payments took weeks or months to clear. The country desperately needed monetary reform. It would take a civil war to achieve it. Financing the Civil War. When the Civil War began in 1861, the federal government faced the familiar problem: how to pay for a war. The government tried to raise money through bonds, but the public was reluctant to buy them. Interest rates were high, but confidence was low. Would the Union survive? Would the bonds ever be repaid? The government also tried to raise money through taxes. In 1861, Congress passed the first federal income tax in American history. It was 3% on incomes over $800. But taxes and bonds weren't enough. In 1861, the government spent $67 million and collected only $42 million in revenue. The deficit was growing rapidly. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase proposed a solution: issue government paper money. Not bonds, not interest-bearing notes, but actual currency that people could use for everyday transactions. This was controversial. The Constitution didn't explicitly grant Congress the power to issue paper money. Many people remembered the continental currency disaster. Issuing fiat currency seemed like a recipe for inflation and chaos. But there was no alternative. In February 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the issuance of $150 million in United States notes. These notes were called greenbacks because of their distinctive green ink on the reverse side. They were not backed by gold or silver. They were not redeemable for specie. They were fiat currency, pure and simple. The greenbacks were legal tender for all debts except import duties and interest on government bonds. This meant creditors had to accept them for debt payments, even if the creditors would prefer gold. The Greenback Era. The initial issue of greenbacks in 1862 was followed by additional issues in 1862 and 1863. By the end of the war, there were about $450 million in greenbacks in circulation. The greenbacks depreciated against gold. In 1862, a greenback dollar was worth about 97 cents in gold. By 1864, it was worth about 40 cents in gold. The depreciation created the same problems that had plagued the continental currency: inflation, uncertainty, and economic distortion. Merchants quoted prices in both greenbacks and gold. A barrel of flour might cost $5 in gold or $12 in greenbacks. Workers demanded higher wages to compensate for the greenback's declining value. The government tried to support the greenback's value by restricting gold trading, but this just created a black market. Gold trading moved to informal exchanges where speculators bought and sold gold for greenbacks. Despite the depreciation, the greenbacks served their purpose. They provided the government with revenue to fight the war. They circulated as currency, facilitating commerce. They didn't collapse entirely like the continental currency had. But the greenbacks created economic distortions. The dual currency system, greenbacks and gold, meant constant calculation of exchange rates. Debtors benefited from the depreciation, as they could repay loans in depreciated currency. Creditors suffered losses. After the war, there was intense debate about what to do with the greenbacks. The National Banking Acts. While greenbacks addressed the government's immediate financing needs, they didn't solve the problem of the chaotic state banking system. That required a different approach. In 1863, Congress passed the National Banking Act. The act created a system of nationally chartered banks that would be regulated by the federal government. To obtain a national charter, a bank had to have minimum capital based on the city's population, purchase federal government bonds, deposit those bonds with the comptroller of the currency, receive national banknotes equal to 90% of the bond's value. The national banknotes would be uniform in design and backed by federal bonds. This would solve the counterfeiting and currency confusion problems that plagued state banknotes. The act also imposed reserve requirements on national banks. Banks had to maintain reserves of lawful money, greenbacks or specie, equal to a percentage of their deposits. Initially, few banks converted to national charters. State banks didn't want federal regulation. They preferred the looser state regulations. In 1865, Congress amended the National Banking Act to impose a 10% tax on state banknotes. This made it unprofitable for state banks to issue notes. If a state bank issued a $10 note, it had to pay a $1 tax, making the effective cost $11. The tax forced state banks to either convert to national charters or stop issuing notes. Most converted. By 1866, there were over 1,600 national banks. The national banknote system was a vast improvement over the previous chaos. All national banknotes had the same design. They were backed by federal bonds, making them secure. Counterfeiting became much harder. But the system had flaws. The money supply was inflexible. It was tied to the amount of federal debt, not to the needs of the economy. When the economy grew and needed more money, the supply couldn't expand unless the government issued more bonds. This inflexibility would cause problems in the decades ahead. The resumption of specie payments. After the Civil War, there was intense debate about the greenbacks. Should they be retired, returning the country to a purely gold-based currency? Should they remain in circulation as fiat currency? Creditors and bondholders wanted the greenbacks retired. They had lent money or bought bonds expecting to be repaid in gold. If they were repaid in depreciated greenbacks, they would suffer losses. Debtors and farmers wanted the greenbacks to remain. They had borrowed money in greenbacks and didn't want to repay in more valuable gold. They also believed an expanding money supply would help the economy grow. This became a major political issue. The Republican Party generally favored returning to gold. The Democratic Party was divided, with Western and Southern Democrats favoring greenbacks and Eastern Democrats favoring gold. In 1875, Congress passed the Resumption Act. The act declared that starting January 1, 1879, the government would redeem greenbacks for gold at face value. One greenback dollar would equal one gold dollar. To prepare for resumption, the Treasury accumulated a gold reserve. By 1879, it had about $100 million in gold. On January 1, 1879, resumption began. Anyone could walk into a Treasury office and exchange greenbacks for gold coins. Almost no one did. The mere knowledge that greenbacks were redeemable for gold made people willing to hold and use greenbacks. The greenback and gold dollar became interchangeable. Resumption was successful. The United States was back on the gold standard. The greenback gold exchange rate stabilized at 1-to-1. The dual currency system ended. But this didn't end the currency debates. New controversies were emerging. The silver question. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, a political movement emerged demanding the free coinage of silver. This movement, strongest among farmers and debtors in the South and West, believed the money supply was too tight and that adding silver coinage would help the economy. The issue was technical but important. Under the gold standard, the dollar was defined as a specific amount of gold. Anyone could bring gold to the mint and have it coined into dollars at a fixed ratio. Silver coinage had been discontinued in 1873 because the market price of silver had risen above the official coinage rate. It made no sense to coin silver when the metal was worth more than the coins. But by the late 1870s, silver prices had fallen. New silver discoveries in the western states had increased supply. Silver miners wanted the government to buy their silver and coin it into money. The silver movement argued that adding silver coinage would increase the money supply, raise prices, and help debtors repay loans. The gold standard, they argued, was too restrictive and benefited creditors at the expense of farmers and workers. In 1878, Congress passed the Bland-Allison Act over President Hayes' veto. The act required the Treasury to purchase $2 to $4 million worth of silver per month and coin it into silver dollars. This was a compromise. It wasn't free silver coinage where anyone could bring silver to the mint and have it coined. Instead, the government would purchase limited amounts of silver and coin it. The silver purchases continued through the 1880s. The Treasury bought silver, coined it into dollars, and put those dollars into circulation. This modestly increased the money supply but didn't cause significant inflation. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which required the Treasury to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver per month, roughly the entire domestic production. The Treasury would issue notes redeemable for either gold or silver. This created a problem. The Treasury was issuing notes faster than the economy was growing. People started redeeming the notes for gold instead of silver because gold was more valuable. The Treasury's gold reserves began declining. The Panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act contributed to the Panic of 1893. Investors worried that the United States would abandon the gold standard. If the Treasury ran out of gold, it couldn't maintain redemption. The dollar would depreciate. Foreign investors began selling American securities and demanding gold. The Treasury's gold reserves fell below the psychologically important level of $100 million. Banks, fearing they wouldn't be able to obtain gold, restricted credit. Businesses failed. Unemployment rose. The panic triggered a severe depression that lasted until 1897. President Grover Cleveland, a gold standard supporter, convinced Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893. But the damage was done. The depression continued. To maintain the gold standard, Cleveland arranged for the Treasury to purchase gold from private banks. The most famous of these arrangements was with J.P. Morgan, who sold the Treasury 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for bonds. This was controversial. Critics accused Cleveland of enriching Wall Street bankers at public expense. But the gold purchases succeeded in maintaining the gold standard. The election of 1896. The currency question became the central issue of the 1896 presidential election. The Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan, who gave his famous Cross of Gold speech attacking the gold standard. Bryan argued that the gold standard was strangling the economy and hurting farmers and workers. He demanded free silver coinage at a ratio of 16:1. 16 ounces of silver would equal 1 ounce of gold in value. The Republican Party nominated William McKinley, who defended the gold standard. McKinley argued that maintaining the gold standard was essential for business confidence and economic stability. McKinley won. The gold standard was secure. In 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, which formally committed the United States to maintaining the dollar at a fixed gold value. But the inflexibility of the money supply remained a problem. The economy was growing, but the money supply couldn't expand fast enough. This created periodic credit crunches and panics. The worst came in 1907. The Panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act contributed to the Panic of 1893. Investors worried that the United States would abandon the gold standard. If the Treasury ran out of gold, it couldn't maintain redemption. The dollar would depreciate. Foreign investors began selling American securities and demanding gold. The Treasury's gold reserves fell below the psychologically important level of $100 million. Banks, fearing they wouldn't be able to obtain gold, restricted credit. Businesses failed. Unemployment rose. The panic triggered a severe depression that lasted until 1897. President Grover Cleveland, a gold standard supporter, convinced Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893. But the damage was done. The depression continued. To maintain the gold standard, Cleveland arranged for the Treasury to purchase gold from private banks. The most famous of these arrangements was with J.P. Morgan, who sold the Treasury 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for bonds. This was controversial. Critics accused Cleveland of enriching Wall Street bankers at public expense. But the gold purchases succeeded in maintaining the gold standard. The election of 1896. The currency question became the central issue of the 1896 presidential election. The Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan, who gave his famous Cross of Gold speech attacking the gold standard. Bryan argued that the gold standard was strangling the economy and hurting farmers and workers. He demanded free silver coinage at a ratio of 16:1. 16 ounces of silver would equal 1 ounce of gold in value. The Republican Party nominated William McKinley, who defended the gold standard. McKinley argued that maintaining the gold standard was essential for business confidence and economic stability. McKinley won. The gold standard was secure. In 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, which formally committed the United States to maintaining the dollar at a fixed gold value. But the inflexibility of the money supply remained a problem. The economy was growing, but the money supply couldn't expand fast enough. This created periodic credit crunches and panics. The worst came in 1907. The Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907 started with the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York. The failure triggered a run on other trust companies and banks. Depositors lined up to withdraw their money. Banks, fearing they would run out of cash, stopped lending and called in loans. Credit markets froze. Businesses couldn't get the short-term loans they needed to operate. Stock prices fell. The economy contracted rapidly. The Treasury tried to help by depositing government funds in New York banks, but it wasn't enough. The crisis worsened. J.P. Morgan organized a private rescue effort. He gathered the leading bankers of New York and convinced them to pool their resources to support struggling institutions. Morgan himself pledged large sums to stabilize the market. The crisis was contained, but barely. The panic demonstrated that the banking system was fundamentally unstable. Periodic crises were inevitable without a central bank that could act as a lender of last resort. Congress began serious discussion of banking reform, creating the Federal Reserve. Creating the Federal Reserve. The Panic of 1907 convinced many politicians and bankers that the United States needed a central bank. But there was deep disagreement about what form it should take. Some wanted a European-style central bank, a single institution controlled by the government. Others wanted a decentralized system controlled by private banks. Some wanted strong government oversight. Others wanted banker control. The debate lasted 6 years. Finally, in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. President Woodrow Wilson signed it on December 23, 1913. The Federal Reserve System was a compromise. It wasn't a single central bank, but a network of 12 regional reserve banks coordinated by a board of governors in Washington. Each reserve bank was owned by the member banks in its district. National banks were required to join the Federal Reserve System. State banks could join voluntarily. Member banks purchased stock in their regional reserve bank and received dividends on that stock. The reserve banks would hold member banks' reserves, provide loans to member banks, issue Federal Reserve notes as currency, clear checks between banks, act as fiscal agents for the federal government. The Board of Governors, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, would oversee the system and set policy. Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve introduced a new form of currency, Federal Reserve notes. These notes were issued by the reserve banks but backed by the reserve bank's assets, primarily government bonds and gold. Federal Reserve notes were different from the existing national banknotes. National banknotes were issued by individual national banks. Federal Reserve notes were issued by the reserve banks and had uniform design throughout the country. Initially, both Federal Reserve notes and national banknotes circulated together. Over time, Federal Reserve notes became dominant. By the 1930s, national banknotes had mostly disappeared, and Federal Reserve notes were the primary form of currency. Each note stated which reserve bank issued it. A note might say Federal Reserve Bank of New York or Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. This designation became less important over time as the notes became fully interchangeable. The notes were redeemable for gold, maintaining the gold standard. Anyone could theoretically exchange Federal Reserve notes for gold coins, though in practice few people did. The Federal Reserve in World War I. The Federal Reserve faced its first major test during World War I. The war required massive government borrowing. From 1917 to 1919, the federal government issued Liberty bonds worth over $20 billion. The Federal Reserve supported the bond sales by keeping interest rates low. This made the bonds more attractive to investors. But low interest rates also encouraged credit expansion and inflation. During the war, prices rose sharply. The money supply expanded as the Federal Reserve accommodated government borrowing. By 1920, prices had roughly doubled from their 1914 levels. After the war, the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy to combat inflation. In 1920 and 1921, they raised interest rates sharply. This triggered a brief but severe recession. Prices fell. Unemployment rose. Businesses failed. But by 1922, the economy had recovered. The Federal Reserve had learned important lessons about managing the money supply. The 1920s and the Fed. During the 1920s, the Federal Reserve developed its role as a manager of the money supply. The Fed learned to use open market operations, buying and selling government bonds, to influence credit conditions. When the Fed bought bonds, it put money into the banking system, encouraging credit expansion. When it sold bonds, it took money out of the system, restricting credit. This was a powerful tool. The Fed could influence economic activity by expanding or contracting credit. During most of the 1920s, the Fed pursued relatively expansionary policies. Credit was easy to obtain. Stock prices rose. The economy grew rapidly. Some economists later argued that the Fed's easy money policies contributed to speculation and the stock market bubble that burst in 1929, the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the Federal Reserve faced a choice: expand credit to support the economy or contract credit to protect the gold standard and punish speculation. The Fed chose contraction. From 1929 to 1933, the Fed allowed the money supply to shrink by about one-third. Thousands of banks failed, and their deposits disappeared from the money supply. The Fed could have prevented these bank failures by acting as a lender of last resort, providing liquidity to struggling but solvent banks. They didn't. Later, economists, particularly Milton Friedman, would argue that the Fed's contractionary policy turned a normal recession into the Great Depression. The Fed's failure to prevent bank failures and money supply contraction was catastrophic. By 1933, the economy had collapsed. Unemployment was 25%. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half. Prices had fallen sharply. The banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. Roosevelt and the end of the gold standard. When Franklin Roosevelt became president in March 1933, his first action was to declare a bank holiday. All banks were closed for 4 days while the government assessed their soundness. During the bank holiday, Roosevelt also suspended gold redemption. Americans could no longer exchange dollars for gold coins. This effectively ended the domestic gold standard. In April 1933, Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring Americans to turn in their gold coins and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. In exchange, they received paper dollars. Holding monetary gold became illegal for American citizens. In 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which transferred ownership of all monetary gold to the Treasury and revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. This was a devaluation of the dollar by about 40%. The dollar remained convertible to gold for international transactions. Foreign central banks could exchange dollars for gold at the new $35 rate. but ordinary Americans could not. This semi-gold standard continued until 1971, the Bretton Woods system. After World War II, the United States led the creation of a new international monetary system at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. The Bretton Woods system established fixed exchange rates between currencies. The dollar was convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar at fixed rates. For example, the British pound was pegged at $4.03 per pound. The French franc was pegged at approximately 5 francs per dollar. These rates could only be changed with international agreement. The system required the United States to maintain gold convertibility at $35 per ounce. Other countries would maintain their dollar peg by buying or selling dollars in foreign exchange markets. This system worked well in the 1950s and early 1960s. International trade expanded. Exchange rate stability facilitated commerce. The dollar became the world's primary reserve currency. But the system had a fundamental flaw. It required the United States to maintain adequate gold reserves to back the dollars held by foreign central banks. The collapse of Bretton Woods. In the 1960s, the United States ran persistent balance of payments deficits. More dollars flowed out of the country than flowed in. Foreign central banks accumulated large dollar reserves. Some of these foreign central banks began converting dollars to gold. The U.S. gold reserve declined from over 20,000 tons in 1958 to about 9,000 tons by 1971. This created a dilemma. The U.S. couldn't maintain both gold convertibility and expansionary monetary policy. If they continued to run deficits and lose gold, the gold standard would collapse. If they tightened policy to protect gold reserves, they would sacrifice domestic economic goals. President Nixon chose to abandon gold convertibility. On August 15, 1971, he announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce. This ended the Bretton Woods system. Exchange rates began to float. The dollar was now a pure fiat currency, unbacked by gold or any other commodity. The fiat dollar era. After 1971, the dollar's value was determined entirely by supply and demand. The Federal Reserve could expand or contract the money supply without worrying about gold reserves. This gave the Fed enormous power. By adjusting the money supply and interest rates, the Fed could influence inflation, unemployment, economic growth, and financial markets. But this power came with responsibility. The Fed had to maintain the dollar's value through prudent policy. If the Fed printed too much money, inflation would erode the dollar's purchasing power. In the 1970s, the Fed struggled with this responsibility. The Great Inflation. From 1965 to 1982, the United States experienced its worst peacetime inflation. Prices rose steadily with brief periods of acceleration. The inflation had multiple causes. The Vietnam War created fiscal deficits. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 raised energy prices. Wage and price spirals developed as workers demanded higher wages to offset inflation and businesses raised prices to cover higher wage costs. But the fundamental cause was monetary policy. The Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to grow too fast. They kept interest rates too low. They accommodated inflation rather than fighting it. By 1980, inflation was running at 14% annually. The dollar was losing purchasing power rapidly. A dollar in 1980 bought less than half what it bought in 1970. The inflation created economic and political chaos. Interest rates rose to unprecedented levels. The prime rate reached 21% in 1980. Mortgage rates exceeded 15%. Savers saw their savings eroded by inflation. borrowers struggled with high interest rates. The Volcker disinflation. In 1979, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was determined to break inflation. Volcker tightened monetary policy dramatically. The Fed raised interest rates and restricted money supply growth. This was painful. The economy entered a severe recession in 1981 to 1982. Unemployment rose to nearly 11%. But the policy worked. Inflation fell from 14% in 1980 to about 4% by 1983. The dollar stabilized. Credibility was restored. The Volcker disinflation established a new norm. The Fed would maintain low and stable inflation even at the cost of short-term economic pain. The Great Moderation. From the mid-1980s to 2007, the U.S. economy experienced what economists called the Great Moderation. Recessions were mild and brief. Inflation remained low and stable. Economic growth was steady. The Fed under Volcker and his successor Alan Greenspan took credit for this stability. They argued that improved monetary policy had tamed the business cycle. Greenspan developed a reputation as a master of central banking. He was called the maestro. When problems emerged, the stock market crash of 1987, the savings and loan crisis, the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98, the Fed responded quickly and effectively. But critics argued that the Fed was creating new problems. By keeping interest rates low and expanding credit, the Fed was encouraging speculation and asset bubbles. The financial crisis of 2008. The critics were right. In 2008, the financial system collapsed. The crisis started in the housing market. Years of easy credit had inflated housing prices. Banks had made risky mortgage loans. These mortgages were packaged into complex securities and sold to investors worldwide. When housing prices began to fall in 2006, mortgage defaults rose. The securities backed by these mortgages lost value. Banks that held these securities faced massive losses. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks, filed for bankruptcy. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending. The financial system was on the verge of complete collapse. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Ben Bernanke, responded aggressively. The Fed cut interest rates to nearly zero, provided emergency loans to banks and financial institutions, purchased massive amounts of government bonds and mortgage securities, created new lending programs. These actions prevented a complete financial collapse. But they also raised questions about the Fed's role and the nature of money. Quantitative easing. The Fed's bond purchase programs became known as quantitative easing or QE. The idea was simple: the Fed would create money and use it to buy bonds. This would lower interest rates and encourage lending. From 2008 to 2014, the Fed purchased over $3 trillion worth of bonds. The Fed's balance sheet, its assets, expanded from about $900 billion to $4.5 trillion. Where did the Fed get this money? It created it. The Fed simply credited banks' accounts with newly created reserves. The banks could use these reserves to make loans. Critics worried that QE would cause inflation. Creating trillions of dollars out of thin air seemed like a recipe for currency devaluation. But inflation remained low. The money created through QE mostly stayed in the banking system as excess reserves. Banks didn't lend it out aggressively. The velocity of money, how fast money circulates through the economy, declined. The Fed's QE programs demonstrated something important. In a modern economy, the relationship between money supply and inflation is complex. Simply creating money doesn't automatically cause inflation if that money isn't spent. The COVID pandemic response. In 2020, the COVID pandemic created another crisis. The economy shut down. Unemployment soared. Businesses closed. The Fed responded even more aggressively than in 2008. They cut interest rates to zero, again purchased bonds at an even faster pace, created new lending programs for businesses and municipalities, coordinated with the Treasury on fiscal programs. The Fed's balance sheet expanded from $4.2 trillion in February 2020 to over $8 trillion by early 2022. The federal government also provided massive fiscal support, enhanced unemployment benefits, direct stimulus payments to households, business loans and grants. The combined fiscal and monetary response totaled trillions of dollars. This time inflation did emerge. By 2021, prices were rising rapidly. By 2022, inflation exceeded 8%, the highest since the early 1980s. The causes were debated. Some blamed the massive monetary and fiscal stimulus. Others pointed to supply chain disruptions and energy prices. Likely all these factors contributed. The current system. As of 2026, the U.S. dollar operates as a pure fiat currency managed by the Federal Reserve. The dollar is not backed by gold or any commodity created through Fed policy decisions, valuable because the U.S. government accepts it for taxes and because people trust it will maintain value, the world's primary reserve currency. The Federal Reserve manages the dollar supply through setting interest rates, buying and selling government bonds, regulating bank reserves, providing liquidity during crises. The dollar's value fluctuates against other currencies based on economic conditions, Fed policy, and international confidence. Despite periodic crises and policy mistakes, the dollar has maintained its role as the world's primary currency. International trade is conducted in dollars. Central banks hold dollars as reserves. Oil and many other commodities are priced in dollars. This gives the United States significant advantages. The government can borrow in its own currency. American businesses can conduct international transactions without exchange rate risk. The Fed's policies have global impact. But the system also faces challenges. Large fiscal deficits raise questions about long-term fiscal sustainability. Rising inflation tests the Fed's credibility. Competing currencies, including cryptocurrencies and digital currencies from other central banks, could challenge the dollar's dominance. The history of the dollar is a history of experimentation, crisis, and adaptation. From colonial bills of credit to continental currency to gold-backed dollars to pure fiat money, the dollar has evolved continuously. What comes next is uncertain. But if history is any guide, the dollar will continue to adapt to changing economic conditions and policy choices. We've covered over 300 years of American monetary history. From the Massachusetts Bay Colony's first bills of credit in 1690 to the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing in the 2020s. From Spanish silver dollars to Federal Reserve notes. From gold standards to fiat currency. The key lessons from this history are: 1. Money is fundamentally a social construct. Currency has value because people believe it has value and because governments require it for tax payments. 2. Managing money supply is incredibly difficult. Too much money causes inflation. Too little causes deflation and economic contraction. Getting it right requires careful judgment and willingness to learn from mistakes. 3. Financial crises are recurring features of monetary systems. From the Panic of 1819 to the Panic of 1893 to the Great Depression to 2008, crises emerge from speculation, excessive credit, and systemic vulnerabilities. 4. Institutional design matters. The specific structure of banking systems and central banks shapes their effectiveness. The decentralized chaos of the free banking era differed dramatically from the relatively stable Federal Reserve era. 5. Politics and money are inseparable. Debates over monetary policy are fundamentally debates about who benefits and who suffers from different policy choices. If you're still awake, congratulations. You now know more about American monetary history than 99% of people. You understand the origins of the Federal Reserve, the history of the gold standard, and the evolution of American currency. More importantly, you now have a foundation for understanding current monetary debates. When you hear about Fed policy, government deficits, or digital currencies, you can connect those issues to historical precedents. Or, if you're like most viewers of this video, you fell asleep somewhere around the discussion of colonial currency exchange rates, which was exactly the point. Either way, thanks for watching. Sleep well. And remember, the dollar has survived over 3 centuries of crises, experiments, and transformations. It will probably survive whatever comes next. Good night.